Welcome to this journey through one of history's most disturbing cases recorded in the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Over the Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri, the morning of October 17, 1913 dawned cold and misty. A thick blanket of fog clung to the valleys, obscuring the dense oak forests and rugged limestone bluffs that characterized this isolated region. With their remote hollows and labyrinthine cave systems, the Ozarks had long attracted those seeking escape from the law, from society, or from their own pasts, a place where secrets could be buried, both figuratively and literally, in soil that yielded little but hardship to those who worked it. At the Tenney County Courthouse in Forsyth, Sheriff Thomas Hadley was finishing his morning coffee when the telegram arrived. The modest two-story structure of local limestone served as both the seat of local government and the headquarters for the county's small law enforcement operation. Having served as sheriff for nearly 17 years, Hadley was 52. He had taken the position after returning from the Spanish-American War with a deep aversion to unnecessary conflict and a slight limp. His weathered face, framed by a neatly trimmed gray beard, was a fixture at county meetings and church socials, a reassuring presence in a community where self-reliance was prized, but neighbors still depended on one another in times of crisis. The telegram came from Roland Jenkins, a farmhand known for his reliability and sobriety, not given to exaggeration or gossip, which made the urgent tone of his message all the more concerning. He made regular deliveries to the more isolated homesteads in the county. Accident at Blackwood Farm, the telegram read. Boy badly hurt. Something not right. Please come quick. What Jenkins had witnessed, as he would later describe in a sworn statement dated October 19, 1913, was the aftermath of what appeared to be a tragic farm accident. He had arrived at the Blackwood property shortly after dawn, bringing a delivery of seed and supplies ordered the previous month. I knew something was wrong, Jenkins stated, when I saw no smoke from the chimney despite the morning chill. Then I heard the wailing, not like normal crying, but something that raised the hair on my neck. Situated approximately 7 miles northeast of Forsyth, the Blackwood homestead was down a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest before opening onto a small clearing. The property consisted of a main house, a two-story timber structure built by James Blackwood's father in the 1880s, a large barn, several outbuildings, and about 40 acres of cleared land for crops and livestock. Beyond that stretched hundreds of acres of forest that the family nominally owned but had never managed to tame. According to county records, James Blackwood had inherited the property in 1902 following his father's death from heart failure. The elder Blackwood had been one of the region's more successful farmers, having diversified into small-scale timber harvesting and occasional fur trapping. Less ambitious but equally hardworking, James had maintained the farm adequately, if not prosperously. His first wife, Sarah Mitchell Blackwood, had been the daughter of Reverend Mitchell of the Forsyth Methodist Church, a respected figure who had helped establish the first proper school in the county. Sarah and James had one child, William, born in 1902. By all accounts preserved in local records and later testimonies, the family was well regarded, if somewhat private. Active in church affairs, Sarah was known for her preserves and quilting skills. The Methodist Church in Forsyth still displayed one of her hand-stitched altar cloths, completed just months before her unexpected death from pneumonia in 1910. The winter of 1909 to 1910 had been particularly harsh, with record-breaking low temperatures and heavy snowfall that had isolated many homesteads for weeks at a time. Several elderly residents and young children had succumbed to illness that season. But Sarah's death at 32 had been especially mourned by the community. After her passing, James had withdrawn somewhat, focusing on his son and the farm until his surprising marriage to Elena Carter in the spring of 1913. The wedding had been a small affair noted in the county clerk's records with the date April 3, 1913, and the signatures of 2 witnesses, neither of whom were from the local community. According to the registration, Elena came from Springfield, where she had worked as a seamstress at the Milligan & Sons Dry Goods Emporium on Commercial Street. How she and James met remains unclear from the records. Some accounts suggest they were introduced through his occasional lumber deliveries to the city, while others indicate a more calculated arrangement through a matrimonial advertisement in the Springfield Republican newspaper. Elena's arrival in the tight-knit rural community had created a subtle but perceptible ripple of unease. Martha Wilkins, whose family owned the next nearest property some 2 miles away, would later tell Sheriff Hadley that Elena carried herself differently, like she was wearing an invisible crown. In her written statement, Martha noted, "She wasn't unkind exactly, but she didn't take to our ways. Didn't join the quilting circle or help with canning. Kept herself apart and kept the boy closer than was natural for a lad his age." William, 11 years old when his father remarried, had been described by his teacher, Miss Abigail Collins, as a bright child, quick with numbers and letters, though naturally reserved since his mother's passing. The school record book from spring 1913 shows William's attendance becoming increasingly sporadic following his father's marriage, with a note from Miss Collins dated May 25 expressing concern about the child's pallor and fatigue when he does attend classes. On that foggy October morning, when Sheriff Hadley arrived at the Blackwood farm, he found a scene that, as he would later record in his official report, struck me as fundamentally wrong. The details, as related, simply did not align with any reasonable explanation. The farmhand Jenkins was waiting anxiously by the gate, reluctant to re-enter the property. Inside the main house, James Blackwood sat at the kitchen table, his face ashen, hands trembling slightly as they cradled a mug of what appeared to be untouched coffee. Elena stood by the hearth, her posture rigid, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. And upstairs, in a small bedroom that still contained hints of its previous occupant, Sarah's rosary hanging from a nail, a faded daguerreotype of grandparents long deceased, lay William. The boy's face was partially bandaged, a crude dressing covering his right eye. Dr. Morris Fleming, the county's only physician, had been summoned before the sheriff's arrival and was repacking his medical bag when Hadley entered the room. "Sheriff," Fleming said quietly, gesturing for them to step into the hallway, "I've done what I can," but he shook his head, the gesture conveying professional frustration and personal distress. A graduate of the St. Louis Medical College, now the Washington University School of Medicine, Fleming had practiced in Tenney County for over 2 decades, treating everything from farming accidents to childbirth complications. He was not easily shaken. What Dr. Fleming described to Sheriff Hadley and later documented in his medical record dated October 18, 1913, was an injury unlike any he had encountered in his years of rural practice. "The ocular cavity shows signs of trauma," he wrote, "but peculiarly no remnants of the organ remain. It is as if the eye was not damaged, but rather removed with some precision. The surrounding tissue indicates the use of a sharp implement, though not one designed for surgical purpose." The boy's stated explanation, that he had fallen on a farm tool while working in the barn, was medically inconsistent with the nature of the wound. Moreover, when Fleming had asked to see the implement in question, James Blackwood had become flustered, claiming it had been cleaned and put away, then contradicting himself by suggesting it might have been discarded due to blood contamination. Elena Blackwood's account, delivered with unsettling composure, described finding William already injured and attempting to render aid before sending for assistance. "I heard him cry out," she told Sheriff Hadley, her voice steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "By the time I reached the barn, he was already on the ground. There was so much blood," she paused, her expression momentarily shifting into something like satisfaction before resuming its mask of concern. "I did what any mother would do." The phrase struck Hadley as odd. Elena was not, after all, William's mother by birth, and from what neighbors had reported, she had made little effort to assume a maternal role in the 6 months since her marriage to James. Something in her tone when she spoke of William had raised the hairs on the back of the sheriff's neck, a sensation he had learned to heed during his years in law enforcement. The subsequent interview with William yielded little clarification. The boy, pale and alarmingly still in his bed, provided only the briefest responses to Hadley's gentle questioning. "I was in the barn, then I wasn't," reads the transcript of his statement, recorded in the sheriff's neat handwriting. When pressed about the presence of his stepmother during the event, William reportedly stared at the wall behind the sheriff for nearly a full minute before simply saying, "She takes care of me now." After further examination, Dr. Fleming determined that William was in no immediate danger, though the loss of his eye was permanent. He prescribed bed rest, regular cleaning of the wound with boiled water, and a return visit in 3 days to check for signs of infection. Before departing, he took Sheriff Hadley aside once more. "There's something else," Fleming murmured, glancing toward the stairs to ensure they weren't overheard. The boy's remaining eye, the left one. He wouldn't look directly at me during the examination. When I finally managed to check it, the pupil was dilated far more than ambient light would explain, and he flinched when I moved my hand near his face, as if the doctor hesitated, as if he expected me to try to take that eye, too. This troubling observation, while not conclusive of any specific wrongdoing, deepened Sheriff Hadley's unease about the situation. However, without clear evidence of a crime and with James Blackwood insistent that the incident had been a tragic accident, there was little official action the sheriff could take. He departed the Blackwood farm with a promise to return in a few days to check on William's recovery and with a growing sense that something sinister lurked beneath the surface of this isolated homestead. The weeks following William's injury were marked by a strange quietude that settled over the Blackwood property like the morning mists that clung to the Ozark Hollows. Dr. Fleming made 3 visits to the homestead, documenting the boy's recovery as progressing without infection, though the child remains unnaturally silent. On his 3rd visit, dated November 7, 1913, the doctor noted in his private journal, later discovered among his effects after his death in 1931, the wound heals cleanly, too cleanly perhaps, given the rustic conditions and reported circumstances. Mrs. B appears to have some knowledge of wound care beyond what one might expect of a seamstress. When I inquired about this, she mentioned an uncle who had been a surgeon's assistant during the war between the states. A plausible explanation, yet delivered with such rehearsed precision as to raise questions. The community's response to the incident was equally subdued. While injuries were common in rural life and typically prompted an outpouring of support, food deliveries, offers of labor assistance, prayer circles, there was something about this particular incident that seemed to inhibit the usual manifestations of community care. As Reverend Mitchell of the Forsyth Methodist Church later wrote in his personal correspondence to his brother in Kansas City, a darkness has fallen over the congregation regarding the Blackwood matter. Questions are asked in whispers, if at all. James, who once sought comfort and prayer following Sarah's passing, has not attended services since the boy's injury. When I called upon them to offer spiritual guidance, I was received with such cold courtesy as to feel my presence was an intrusion. The stepmother, Elena, spoke mostly of the child's good fortune in having her nursing skills rather than expressing gratitude for his survival or divine protection. She referred to William's remaining eye as sufficient for her purposes, a phrasing that has troubled my thoughts and prayers since. This letter, preserved in the archives of the Kansas City Public Library as part of the Mitchell family papers, provides one of the few contemporaneous accounts of the atmosphere surrounding the Blackwood family during this period. Most neighbors, when later interviewed by authorities, admitted to having deliberately avoided the farm following William's injury, citing reasons ranging from respect for the family's privacy to more nebulous concerns about the change that had come over the place. Martha Wilkins, whose sense of Christian duty eventually overcame her unease, was one of the few who maintained sporadic contact with the Blackwood household. Her observations, while not immediately actionable, added to the growing collection of troubling details surrounding the case. The boy never played outdoors anymore, she told Sheriff Hadley in a statement dated December 8, 1913. Before, even after his mama died, you'd see him running with the dog or climbing that big oak by the creek. Now he just sat either on the porch or by the window like he was watching for something. And the dog, that old hound that used to bark at everything that moved, it was gone. When I asked after it, Mr. Blackwood said they'd given it away because the barking agitated the boy's condition. But William loved that dog something fierce. The Blackwood farm began to take on an almost tangible atmosphere of tension. James, once a regular at community gatherings and the general store in Forsyth, now appeared only for essential business in town. When he did venture out, neighbors noted significant changes in his demeanor. Elijah Thompson, proprietor of the general store, recorded in his business ledger beside the Blackwood account, JB purchased usual monthly supplies plus unusual quantity of salt. Appeared haggard, hands shaking. When asked about family, responded curtly that all were as well as could be expected. Declined credit for first time since establishment of account in 1902. Elena was rarely seen at all. On the few occasions she accompanied James to town, She remained in their wagon, a dark figure observing the main street of Forsyth with what several witnesses described as unsettling intensity. Children, with their unfiltered perceptions, began to tell stories about the Eye Lady, claiming that she watched them through the wagon's small rear window, even when appearing to face forward. The farm itself showed signs of neglect, fields partially harvested, livestock thin and restless. As winter approached, smoke from their chimney rose thin and intermittent, suggesting the hearth was not being maintained as it should in the increasingly cold weather. This detail, seemingly minor, was in fact significant in a community where the proper management of heat sources through the harsh Ozark winters was not merely a matter of comfort, but of survival. December 7, 1913, marked a turning point in the case. Motivated by concern and the approaching Christmas season, Martha Wilkins made the long trek to the Blackwood farm with a basket of preserved goods, an act of charity disguised as neighborly courtesy. The day was unusually warm for December, the temperature having risen to nearly 50 degrees by midday, creating a false sense of spring that Martha would later describe as deceptive, like the calm before a storm. But what she found prompted her immediate return to Forsyth and a frantic report to Sheriff Hadley. The sheriff's log contains her statement recorded in his precise handwriting. The boy was sitting on the porch, thin as a rail, with that bandage still on his eye. When I called out, he didn't respond, just stared with his good eye. When Mrs. Blackwood finally came out, she stood so close behind him that her skirts brushed his shoulders. She thanked me for the basket, but didn't invite me in. And Sheriff, I swear on my Bible, when she smiled, William flinched like he'd been struck. Martha's description continued, providing details that, while not explicitly indicating criminal activity, painted a picture of profound wrongness. The house behind them was dark, all the curtains drawn, despite the pleasant day. I caught a whiff of something from inside. Not the usual cooking smells or wood smoke, but something sharp and medicinal. When I mentioned that William looked thin and offered to bring by some of my chicken stew later in the week, Mrs. Blackwood said, "He has no need for your charity. I provide everything he requires." Then she put her hand on his shoulder, and I saw her fingers press into him so hard they left white marks on his shirt. Most disturbing to Martha was what happened as she was preparing to leave. I asked William directly if he was feeling better, trying to get him to speak to me like he used to. He opened his mouth, but before he could make a sound, Mrs. Blackwood said, "Tell Mrs. Wilkins how well you're doing with your lessons, William." And that boy who used to chatter about birds and stories and numbers, he just repeated, "I'm doing well with my lessons, Mrs. Wilkins." But Sheriff, his voice wasn't his own. It was flat, like he was reading words without understanding them. And when I looked into his good eye, it seemed vacant, like nobody was home behind it. Taking Martha's concern seriously, Sheriff Hadley decided that another official visit to the Blackwood property was warranted. The following day, December 8th, he and Dr. Fleming made the journey together, arriving at the farm shortly after noon. Their official report of this visit is remarkably reserved, noting only the basic facts of their interactions with the family and Dr. Fleming's medical assessment of William's healing process. But in a separate personal notebook found among Sheriff Hadley's effects after his death, a small leather-bound journal in which he recorded thoughts and observations he deemed too speculative or subjective for official documentation, he wrote, "Approached the Blackwood place with Fleming around midday. Unlike Martha's account, no one was on the porch. Had to knock 3 times before James answered. His appearance shocked me. The man has aged years in weeks. Grey now streaks his beard, and his eyes are deeply shadowed. He seemed both relieved and alarmed to see us, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder as we spoke on the porch. Elena appeared as if summoned by some silent signal. Unlike James, she shows no signs of strain. Indeed, she looked somehow stronger, more substantial than at our last meeting. She positioned herself between James and the door, ostensibly to offer us coffee, which we declined, but the effect was to control his access to the house interior. When we requested to see William, a strange negotiation seemed to unfold between husband and wife, not in words, but in glances. Eventually, Elena went upstairs to prepare the boy, as she put it. The 7 minutes of her absence were silent and strained. James did not speak except to answer direct questions, and then only in monosyllables. The house itself felt wrong, too cold despite the fire visibly burning in the hearth, too quiet despite the normal creaks and settling sounds of an old timber structure. William, when finally brought downstairs, moved like someone much older or infirm. The bandage on his right eye was clean and professionally applied, more skillfully than I would have expected from home care. As Fleming examined him, I observed the boy's reactions. He responded to physical stimuli, flinching appropriately when Fleming tested sensitivity around the wound, but his emotional responses seemed muted or delayed, as if reaching him through some filter. Most telling was his reaction when Fleming asked about his daily activities. William looked to Elena before answering, his gaze seeking permission or guidance. She smiled and nodded slightly, whereupon he recited what sounded like a prepared statement about reading, simple mathematics, and helping with indoor chores. When Fleming asked specifically what he had read recently, William hesitated, then said, "Mother Elena reads to me from the special book." Elena quickly interjected that she had been reading him selections from Pilgrim's Progress, an appropriate choice for his moral education. The boy nodded agreement, but Fleming later told me he believed the child had never heard of the work before that moment. Before departing, I asked to use their outhouse, a pretext to observe the rear of the property without raising suspicion. The barn, where the accident allegedly occurred, was padlocked, unusual for a working farm in daylight hours. More concerning were the scratch marks on the inside of the back door of the main house, at approximately the height a child might reach. When I casually mentioned these to James as I returned, Elena answered for him. The previous owner kept hunting dogs inside during winter, such destructive creatures. According to county records, the Blackwood family has owned this property since 1883, and to my knowledge, they have never kennelled hunting dogs indoors. This visit, while raising Sheriff Hadley's suspicions, still provided insufficient grounds for any official intervention. The law in 1913 rural Missouri gave authorities limited power to intervene in family matters without clear evidence of criminal activity. William was being fed and housed, showed no visible signs of beating or abuse, and the strangeness of the household, while concerning, did not constitute a legal basis for action. Dr. Fleming's medical examination during this visit added another layer to the developing picture. His notes from this examination contain a curious entry: healing progresses normally, though the socket appears to have been cleaned with unusual thoroughness. When I inquired about the specific care regimen, Mrs. Blackwood answered promptly, describing a solution of boiled water and salt. The boy's reaction to her voice, a slight tensing of the shoulders, a downward gaze, suggests an unnatural deference, or perhaps fear. Of additional note, William's remaining eye shows signs of prolonged weeping, though no tears were evident during our visit. In a separate communication to a medical colleague in St. Louis dated December 12, 1913, discovered in 1967 during cataloguing of the Washington University Medical Archives, Fleming expressed more direct concerns. "I have encountered a most troubling case that tests the boundaries of both medical ethics and my obligations as a citizen. The injury itself, the complete removal of a child's eye in supposedly accidental circumstances, defies logical explanation given the reported mechanism of injury. More concerning is the subsequent behavior of the patient and his caretakers. The stepmother displays a level of medical knowledge inconsistent with her background, particularly in wound management and what appears to be the administration of sedative substances. The father exhibits signs of duress or coercion. The child demonstrates symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological trauma beyond what the physical injury would explain. I find myself in the uncomfortable position of suspecting harmful intent without adequate evidence to justify intervention. Rural practice often requires one to respect family privacy and autonomy. But in this instance, I fear that such respect may enable ongoing harm. The law provides little recourse without more substantive proof of wrongdoing. I document everything meticulously in hopes that should my concerns prove founded, there will be a record that might have helped prevent whatever may come. As 1913 gave way to 1914, the Blackwood case might have faded into obscurity, just another tragedy in the hard life of the Ozarks, a region where premature death and disfiguring injury were all too common. The winter intensified, bringing heavy snowfall and temperatures that dropped well below zero for weeks at a time. Travel became difficult even for short distances, and the more remote homesteads effectively disappeared from community life until the spring thaw. But on January 28, 1914, something occurred that reignited local concern. William failed to appear at school following the winter break. The Forsyth School, a simple one-room structure that served children from ages 6 to 14 across the surrounding 10 square miles, had reopened on January 20 after the Christmas holiday and traditional January hunting season. When William remained absent for a full week, Miss Abigail Collins, following her duty as teacher, sent a note to the Blackwood farm inquiring about his well-being and expected return. The response came not in the form of a note, but in person. James Blackwood appeared at the schoolhouse after dismissal on January 30 looking, as Miss Collins would later testify, like a man who had not slept in days. He produced a letter supposedly written by Dr. Fleming recommending that William remain home to recover his strength. His manner was strange, Miss Collins noted in her statement to Sheriff Hadley. He would not meet my eye, and when I expressed hope for William's swift recovery, he simply nodded and turned to leave. I called after him, asking if William might benefit from schoolwork sent home, as he had always been an eager student. Mr. Blackwood paused at the door and said very quietly, "Elena believes his education is best managed at home now." There was something in his tone, resignation perhaps, or fear, that troubled me deeply. A diligent educator with genuine concern for her pupils, Miss Collins took the unusual step of visiting Dr. Fleming that same evening to inquire about William's condition. What she discovered prompted her immediate report to Sheriff Hadley. Dr. Fleming had written no such letter and, in fact, had not seen William since the December 8 visit with the sheriff. This discrepancy prompted a more formal investigation. Sheriff Hadley, now joined by County Prosecutor Edgar Wilson, returned to the Blackwood farm on February 3, 1914, with a warrant to inspect the premises. The legal basis for the warrant was relatively thin, suspected medical fraud and educational neglect, but it provided the authority needed to conduct a more thorough examination of the property and the family situation. The ensuing search revealed nothing overtly criminal, no signs of physical abuse severe enough to justify removal of the child, no evidence of illegal activities. William, when questioned separately from his father and stepmother, maintained that he was being treated well, though he spoke in a monotone voice and kept his gaze fixed on the floor. When asked specifically about school, he stated that Mother Elena teaches me important things now, things they don't know at school. Sheriff Hadley's report notes that the boy appeared adequately nourished, if thin, and appropriately dressed for the season. His eye socket had healed completely, though no prosthetic eye had been provided. The bandage had been replaced by a simple black patch. William's remaining eye, as noted by both Hadley and Prosecutor Wilson, appeared unusually dull, the once vibrant blue described by neighbors and former teacher now faded to a flat, almost gray hue. The interior of the Blackwood home presented a study in contrasts. The main living areas, kitchen, parlor, James's bedroom, showed signs of neglect, unwashed dishes, dusty surfaces, clothing left unfolded. By contrast, the rooms occupied by Elena and William were meticulously ordered. William's bedroom contained few personal items beyond clothing and a small wooden horse carved in a style that Martha Wilkins later identified as similar to toys made by her late husband for local children. Most of the books and small treasures that might be expected in a child's room were absent. Elena's private sewing room, adjacent to the bedroom she supposedly shared with James, though the condition of that room suggested he no longer slept there, was locked. When asked to open it, she produced a key from a chain around her neck. The room beyond was immaculate, containing a sewing table, several bolts of dark fabric, and a writing desk with a leather-bound journal that Elena quickly moved to a drawer, explaining it contained private household accounts. What the search did uncover, however, was a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards of Elena's sewing room. Inside the box was a collection of items that, while not illegal, struck the investigators as deeply unsettling. Several locks of dark hair tied with string, consistent with William's coloring, 5 small teeth, apparently human and childlike, and a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a preserved animal eye, though Dr. Fleming would later note in his personal journal that the specimen bears a disturbing resemblance to a human organ. When confronted about these items, Elena Blackwood remained composed. The loose board was discovered by Prosecutor Wilson, who noted a slight difference in the coloration of the wood and the newer appearance of the nails securing it. "Mementos," she explained. "From my own lost children." This was the first mention of Alina having been previously married or having had children. No records confirming this claim have ever been found in Springfield or the surrounding counties. James Blackwood, present during this exchange, appeared genuinely surprised by the revelation but did not contradict his wife. In a later private conversation with Sheriff Hadley, documented in the sheriff's personal notebook, James offered a halting explanation: "Alina doesn't speak of it often. It pains her too deeply. She was married young in St. Louis before coming to Springfield. There were 3 children, all lost to fever within a month of each other. Her husband abandoned her soon after. The mementos are all she has left of them." When Hadley pressed for details, names, dates, the location of graves, James became flustered and eventually admitted, "I don't rightly know those particulars." Alina finds such questions distressing. The investigation reached an impasse. The items in the box, while macabre, were not definitively proven to be anything other than what Alina claimed. The discrepancies in James's account, while suspicious, did not constitute a crime. William himself, when carefully questioned about his treatment, maintained that he was not being harmed, though his effect remained flat and his responses seemed rehearsed. Prosecutor Wilson, frustrated by the lack of actionable evidence, suggested to Sheriff Hadley that they might use the educational neglect angle to at least have William temporarily removed for assessment. "The boy is clearly being isolated," Wilson argued, as recorded in Hadley's notes of their conversation. "At minimum, we could get him away from that woman long enough to determine if he's being coerced or drugged." But the legal framework of the time provided limited protection for children, particularly in rural areas where home education was common and parental authority was considered nearly absolute. Consulted on the matter, Dr. Fleming expressed concern about the potential trauma to William of forced separation, particularly given his already fragile psychological state. "The boy has lost his mother, his eye, and possibly his sense of safety," Fleming noted. Without clear evidence of immediate danger, removing him from familiar surroundings might cause more harm than good. Reluctantly, Sheriff Hadley and Prosecutor Wilson concluded the investigation without taking further action, though they established a schedule of regular welfare checks on the Blackwood farm. The first of these, conducted on February 17, 1914, found the situation largely unchanged. The second, on March 5, noted that William appeared to have gained some weight and spoke more readily, though still with that peculiar flatness of effect. Alina, during this visit, remained within arm's reach of the boy at all times. The winter of 1914 was particularly harsh in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall isolated many homesteads for weeks at a time, making the scheduled welfare checks difficult to maintain. The Blackwood farm, already remote, became virtually inaccessible between mid-March and early April. And by then, the community's attention had largely shifted to other matters: preparations for spring planting, a contentious local election, the distant rumblings of trouble in Europe that would eventually become the First World War. On April 17, 1914, exactly 6 months after William's initial injury, Martha Wilkins once again made the journey to the Blackwood farm. Her visit was prompted by a dream. She would later tell Sheriff Hadley that she had seen William calling to her from the edge of the forest, his face obscured by shadows. The dream had recurred 3 nights in succession with such vividness that Martha, though not typically superstitious, felt compelled to check on the boy's welfare. What she found at the farm was James Blackwood alone, splitting wood in the yard with methodical, almost mechanical movements. When Martha approached, he paused, the axe held loosely at his side, his expression momentarily blank before recognition dawned. "Mrs. Wilkins," he greeted her, his voice rough as if from disuse. "What brings you out this way?" Martha, explaining that she was checking on neighboring farms after the long winter, inquired after William and Alina. James informed her that they had gone to Springfield to consult a specialist about a prosthetic eye for the boy. "They'll be gone," he said, "for at least a week." Something about James's manner troubled Martha deeply. In her statement to Sheriff Hadley, she noted, "He wasn't himself. His hands shook when he offered me coffee, and he kept glancing at the stairs like he expected someone to come down. When I asked when exactly they had left for Springfield, he gave me 3 different answers in the span of our conversation. First, he said they'd left yesterday morning, then later mentioned that the stage took them on Tuesday, which would have been 3 days prior, and finally commented that Alina had been planning the trip since Sunday week, suggesting they had left even earlier. With the intuition of someone who had known James Blackwood for over a decade, Martha pressed him gently on these inconsistencies. He became agitated, she reported, dropping a cup which shattered on the floor. When I moved to help him clean up the pieces, he nearly shouted at me to leave them. "You'll know if they're moved," he said, then immediately tried to laugh it off as a joke about his wife's attention to detail. But there was real fear in his eyes, Sheriff. Not the kind of fear a man has of his wife's displeasure, but something deeper. Before departing, Martha asked if she might leave some fresh bread and preserves for the family's return. James agreed, allowing her into the kitchen for the first time in months. While there, Martha observed several troubling details: a large quantity of salt in open containers, an unusual number of knives laid out on a clean cloth, and most concerning, what appeared to be bloodstains on the floor near the cellar door, partially covered by a rug that had been hastily repositioned, its edge still folded back. Already harboring suspicions about the Blackwood situation, Sheriff Hadley decided to investigate immediately. His deputy, Samuel Tucker, was dispatched to Springfield to inquire at the offices of the only two eye specialists in the city. Neither had any record or knowledge of an appointment with a boy named William Blackwood, or any patient matching his description. Furthermore, the stagecoach company that served the route between Forsyth and Springfield had no record of passengers by those names in the previous week. Meanwhile, the sheriff himself returned to the Blackwood farm, arriving just before dusk on April 18, 1914. The sheriff's official report of that evening is remarkably sparse, noting only that the property appeared abandoned and that no response was received to repeated knocking. What the report doesn't mention, but what Sheriff Hadley later confided to Reverend Mitchell, was the state of the house when he finally forced entry. The rooms were immaculately clean, swept bare of personal items. The hearth was cold, suggesting no fire had been lit for days, despite the spring chill. The kitchen had been scrubbed to an almost clinical sterility. The bloodstains observed by Martha were nowhere to be seen. James and Alina's bedroom contained no clothing in the drawers, no personal effects on the dressing table. It was as if they had never existed. Most disturbing was the discovery in William's room. His bed had been stripped of linens, and carved into the wooden headboard was a crude symbol resembling an eye. Below it, scratched in a less steady hand, were the words, "She sees." The small wooden horse, the only toy Martha had mentioned seeing in the room during her previous visits, was positioned in the center of the bare mattress, its carved eyes gouged out. The cellar, accessed through a door in the kitchen floor, contained nothing unusual at first glance: preserved foods, tools, the normal detritus of rural life. But in the earthen wall at the far end, partially concealed behind a stack of empty crates, Sheriff Hadley discovered a small opening. Beyond it lay a space approximately 6 foot square, its floor packed earth, its walls reinforced with timber. A chain was bolted to one wall, ending in a manacle sized for a child's ankle. The floor of this hidden room was stained dark in places, and a small pile of fabric in the corner proved to be a child's nightshirt, torn and similarly stained. A search of the surrounding property revealed no immediate signs of the family. Their wagon and single horse were gone, as were most of their clothes and valuables. It appeared that the Blackwoods had simply packed up and left, not an uncommon occurrence in the transient rural communities of the time. Yet, the hasty nature of their departure, coupled with the inconsistencies in James's account to Martha Wilkins and the disturbing discoveries in the house, raised troubling questions. Sheriff Hadley issued alerts to neighboring counties requesting information on the whereabouts of the Blackwood family. For several weeks, no leads emerged. Then, in early May 1914, a station master in Joplin, some 100 miles west of Forsyth, reported encountering a woman and a boy matching Alina and William's descriptions boarding a train bound for Kansas City. This report, transmitted by telegraph to Sheriff Hadley on May 6, 1914, contained several details that heightened rather than alleviated concern. The station master, Horace Jenkins, described the woman as expensively dressed with a manner that suggested wealth, or at least substantial means, a significant change from Alina's previous modest attire. The boy, wearing a patch over his right eye, was described as uncommonly still, like a mechanical toy awaiting winding. He spoke not a word during their transaction, and when addressed directly, looked to the woman before responding with only a nod or shake of his head. Most troubling was Jenkins's observation of the pair's luggage. Among their belongings was a doctor's bag of good quality leather, which fell open briefly during loading. I glimpsed medical instruments inside, scalpels and the like, which seemed odd for travelers of their description. When I commented on it, the woman said curtly that her